friends. Welcome back to the Space for Faith podcast. My name is Mike Goldsworthy, and just a gift to have you hanging out here and giving some of your time to process all of the things that we process on here. And welcome back. I know we launched a new podcast last week, and it had been several months, but I did no intro. I mean, a part of the deal was that I just had not had the capacity to be able to put these together, but I've got several of them that I've recorded and I wanted to get out, and I was like, forget just doing this little 2 minutes on the front end just felt a bit too much for me. So I was like, forget that. I'm just going to get something out so I can start getting them out. So we've got several that we're going to hear from over the next several weeks. And a part of what was going on for me over the last several months is that I've been reorienting some of my work and have been having to give a bit of time and energy in that direction. And I will talk more about some of that later on here, but maybe the short version of it here is that one of the things I'm finding myself spending more and more time doing is serving as an executive coach. And I am working with leaders and teams who value health and wholeness as a part of their life and leadership. And so I continue to work with pastors, but beyond that, I now have been working with several CEOs and with several executive teams. And I've been doing more and more in that direction. And so, if you're somebody who you lead a team, you're a part of a team, you're in some sort of leadership, and you just you care about who you are and how you show up, you recognize that the way that you contribute to the world and your vocation and your work actually flows out of who you are, and that you want to take some, whether it's next steps in your leadership, you want to show up in healthier ways, you've got some things that are sort of keeping you from that you have more to give and contribute. There's frustrations that have gotten in your way, obstacles, whatever those sorts of things are. Reach out and we can have a chat and see if I could be helpful for you. It's been just a gift and an honor to be invited into some of these spaces with executive teams and with CEOs and some other leaders. So would love to get to chat with you. But Today we get to have my friend Casey Tygrett on, who has a new book coming out, and I think actually I'm releasing this on the day that the book comes out, called The Gift of Restlessness. And we're going to talk about his book, what a gift it is, and I think you are just going to love and appreciate Casey. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my conversation with Casey Tygrett. Well, friends, I'm glad to get to introduce you to my friend Casey Tygrett here, who is coming to us from the great Chicagoland area today. And Casey, you and I first met, I don't remember, I was trying to remember what year it was, I don't know, but I met you at the North American Christian Convention, which no longer exists anymore.
And
or has morphed.
And it is morphed, but man, I mean, you could just imagine what a convention of Christians might look like, and that is exactly what it was.
For those who are not in the know of what would be called the Brotherhood of Churches, which is what I was raised in, that this was this convention of the coming together not only of pastors and leaders, but back in the day, it was families would take road trips. They would plan their summer vacation around this, and it would be this convergence of people from churches all over the country that were a part of this non-denominational Christian church sort of movement, and they would all sort of come together for a week of Bible teaching and Bible quiz competitions. And I never went. Well, no, I went to one growing up. That was it. But my wife, she was a part of Bible Bowl. So she competed there.
So she was a real Christian.
She was a real Christian. I was not, for which her parents have never forgiven.
Well, I would think back in the day, before podcasts, before large scale media, that was also this movement. Preaching has been such a big deal, and that was the only place you could really see people outside of your own preacher. And you'd heard rumors about these legendary preachers, and you just didn't get to see them unless you went to the North American. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, I met you at, I don't know if it was the last one that I went to or one of the last ones I went to, where I got talked into going. I had sworn off ever going again. And I'm with this gathering of pastors who helped put it together. And the pitch they gave me was, they said, Mike, you don't need the North American Christian Convention, but the North American Christian Convention needs you. And so I was
No
like, all right, I'll
pressure.
show up. So I show up to it, and it didn't need me at all. Nobody cared that I was there. And, but there was this like renegade small group of folks who were about my age who didn't sit in any of the sessions and would just like hang out together. And you were a part of that group. So that's where I got to find you. And for me, it was a gift because I was in this time where like I was leading this church, but I didn't know where I fit in the church world. And I couldn't figure out like, who are my people? Where's my place? But I would meet folks along the way, and you were one of those people that I would feel this like resonance with and kinship with, and just appreciated the way that you were processing and thinking about things. So I don't know if I've ever told you, like, you were just a really helpful voice for me at a time where like I was like, I don't know, like where do I fit in the church world? But there are folks like Casey, so I feel like there's some sort of space for me.
Yeah. Gosh, thanks. That's that belonging question is really important, and I feel like that's the first thing we lose, and that's where like the threads start to come apart. So I'm glad we were able to give you a little tether, me and some of the other renegades that were part of that group, for sure. That was a group effort.
Yeah, well, we are chatting today. I mean, that's a good transition into the book that you have written that is releasing soon, coming out on April 25th, called The Gift of Restlessness. And as soon as I saw you post what the title of the book was, that I knew like, oh, we've got to chat because this feels like up my alley. And knowing you, I knew it would be thoughtful and generative. And I got to tell you, man, I was mentioning this before we started recording, but like it was so good. It was so significant for me. I found myself tearing up at times with just like resonance with some of the things that you were writing. And it was one of those books, like I read it pretty quick to prep for our conversation. Like I probably read it in a couple of sittings and realized when I got to the end of it, I was like, oh, there's so much in here that I need to like re-engage. And even the practices that you offer throughout it that I want to re-engage, that I'll genuinely go through it again. But slower to like read it from me and from my own sort of experience. So all that to sort of like set us up to talk about your book. And I haven't even introduced you yet, other than to say you're a renegade. So I don't have to read your bio or what, like, you want to share with folks a little bit about who you are, and then we'll get into your book.
Sure. Yeah. Besides being a renegade, I am a pastor and spiritual director. I've been in some kind of church work since probably 1996. I grew up in the Nazarene tradition, the Church of the Nazarene, and have made my way through several different church streams over the years, just different thinking and different theology. But when I was in college, I got somewhat ambushed by some spiritual giants, people like Henry Nouwen and Thomas Merton, some mystics, mostly Catholic, and they painted this picture of a broader and more generous God and a broader and more generous faith than I was used to. And that sort of got me walking down the road of conversations around spiritual formation, spiritual disciplines. And so that was always this sort of, it was the background song in my head for most of the things that I did. So even in pastoral ministry, a lot of what I was doing in church work was trying to help people become who they were supposed to be. And then as I was learning about things like spiritual stages and growth and maturity and attachment and detachment, some of these other principles, I realized that, faith was built to change. So how do I help people do that? And that led me to become a spiritual director. So I do that personally, just in my own practice, but I also work with a company called Soul Care, and we do that for leaders of churches or parachurches or non-for-profits, and faith-forward people who work in marketplace roles. Just trying to help people lead from a place of soul health and soul flourishing, to not burn out, to keep the most important thing about them. So, I live in Chicagoland, have for a long, long time, 14, 15 years. My wife and I have been married it'll be 23 years in August, and we have a 16-year-old daughter, and I like long walks on the beach, getting caught in the rain. And I think that's about it. Yeah. I should cover it.
Yeah. Long walks on the beach. Is that like the Great Lakes beach or like real beaches?
It's the Michigan beaches, which, in the summer it feels similar, but it's not the same as where you are on the Best Coast. So I don't know what else to do with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love the theme of restlessness and the idea of, like, one of the things you said early on in the book was that you feel like it's this constant thing showing up for you. I don't remember how you said it, that it's like every 6 months or so that you kind of have this restlessness, which, like, that was one of the things that drew me in immediately, because I was like, I feel like that's true of me, that there's this sort of like dissatisfaction with something that like resurfaces on a fairly regular basis. And I feel like a part of my own work of formation has been trying to like pay attention to that, lean into that, figure out what to do with that. One of the thoughts that I had when I first read that, and feel free to like, go where you want to go if you want to define restlessness a little bit. I know you do that in the book, if that's helpful. But I was kind of curious, do you feel like, is that I identify as an Enneagram 3. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I don't remember where you identify. I don't know if that's something that is enigmatic to somebody who has a certain sort of disposition towards life, or is that like, is your experience like that's just a normal cycle that a lot of us in human condition experience?
I think it's a normal cycle. I think when you look at things like Enneagram, it shows you how we express it. So I identify as a 4. So a lot of my restlessness I try to express in either creative ways or in trying to be unique. My daughter also probably is in that Enneagram 4 space, which, that's a challenge. There's, the Enneagram is built to show you your shadow side. So confronting the fact that you need to be original, you need to be unique, that urge is a certain kind of restlessness. And I feel like that's part of it. I feel like part of just being a human in the US, because that's my only cultural context, is just filled with either artificial or very real restlessness. Either artificial restlessness that says the stuff you have isn't good enough. And once you accept that, then you realize I got to have new stuff, but I'm not sure how I'm going to get to that. But there's also the very real restlessness of political discourse, race and gender discourse, from a church standpoint, just the state of faith in America. There's this sense that we can't. So when I define restlessness, I say that it's this spot where we are in this irritated, unsettled season where we cannot go backwards. We have no idea what the future or what forward looks like. So we're just sort of stuck in the present tense. And that's where restlessness really digs in. And so like bartenders say, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. I would say you can't go back to the way things used to be, but you have no idea what the future looks like. And so we're just sort of grounded in that present moment where we feel like everything needs to change, but we don't know how. We just know we can't go back. And so that's really the moment where we confront our restlessness, the restlessness of others. But I do, Mike. I feel like it's a pretty common thing. I've not met any person, I would say, who I would look at and go, well, that person's never obviously dealt with. They've never dealt with this. I think any person that I've walked with in spiritual direction or just friendships, like they all have that irritated, unsettled feeling about something.
Yeah, so I was kind of curious what like spurred you on towards creating this, where I remember I read somewhere in the book, or maybe it was even in the acknowledgments, where you said that it had been sitting for years as a document on your computer that you then re-engaged. And like I can get the, you talk a bit about the pandemic and things of that and how it sort of plays into this. And I can get sort of that season spurring it on. But you were obviously paying attention to this before then the pandemic hit, before, like, what was sort of stirring in you that you were seeing, like, there's something to this restlessness to pay attention to?
Yeah, I've long had just a really deep curiosity for the places where faith intersects, or human life intersects with faith, and all the aspects of it. And I love people who are learning about what it means to be human, because I feel like to be human is to be spiritual. Taking the classic narratives of faith where humanity was created by the divine and then breathed into, was inspired, was given spirit. So we're all just like spirit in dirt, I guess. And so anything we can know about the dirt necessarily impacts what we know about spirit. So the other two books that I've written, one about curiosity and one about memory, those are all just me being interested in, hey, where do these two things meet? With this book, Restlessness was way more personal. I felt like I've carried this in me ever since I was growing. I feel like I inherited it from my family. And it's done, as I've done the work of therapy and spiritual direction, I've noticed how it's affected relationships, like my commitment to people, my commitment to jobs, this feeling of like, I'm really passionate about something, and then I start doing it. And then about 4 or 5 weeks later, I'm like, let's do something else. What is that? Am I just not committing well? Or is it this sense of, hey, something needs to change? I'd like to go back to when this was brand new and shiny. And so I started working on this idea probably in 2018 or so, and put together a book. And this is also a little tangent into writing. Books are weird.
Great.
Books are just weird things. I sat in my basement and I put all this stuff on a page, and now it's like out there and you're reading it and it's causing you to feel things. Like, how does that still just boggles my mind. But publishing is even stranger. So I put together this proposal, and I have a friend who helps me talk to publishers, and he took it around and nobody wanted to do anything with it. And I still like the idea. So I'm like, I'll just put this away for a while. And then the pandemic happened. And what was interesting is how everybody's human story changed. And it was simultaneously one of the most ubiquitous things, like one of the most widespread things. All of us have a pandemic story, or we do like date things from, well, that was pre-2020. But at the same time, not only do we all have this sort of pandemic story, but it changes how we see things that were happening anyway. So there are a lot of things in my life that would have happened anyway, but the fact that they happened during a time of illness and lockdown, and crisis and instability and high stress and things like that. So it was odd during the writing of the book. They were like, we don't want to make this into a pandemic book. And I said, gosh, anything that's written after 2020 is going to have to be, if it's nonfiction, or even if it's fiction, it's going to have to somehow deal with that. And so I came back around to the original proposal and put some new stories in, shifted some viewpoints. I mean, it changed the whole way that I looked at it, because I saw myself differently. And so the book really became, this is way more reflective. It's way more personal than anything I've written before, just because of that. I felt like I needed to love the world by loving this part of myself. And it just so happened I had the opportunity to do that in public, which is so weird, but I think it's so good as well. Because when you see somebody that you can go, oh yeah, that's me too. From a faith perspective, that's me too. From a dad perspective, that's me too. From a white American perspective, that's me too. That's what I'm. So when you can see that, there's a joy and a hope there. So that's why I wanted to see this through. And it wasn't easy, but I kind of owed it to people who would see that story or hear something about their restlessness just got normalized. Like, let's just say this. Let's say it's true. Let's just all get to the point of accepting that it's a reality.
Yeah. Well, you quote, I don't know how to say her name, Joan Chittister?
I think that's right.
Is that?
Yeah.
Sure?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. That's what, yeah.
Joan, if you're listening, just
you...
write in and tell us how to pronounce
that. Well, yeah, and Joan, thank you for writing this, that dissatisfaction becomes a spiritual director of our souls. Without the dissatisfaction of the soul, how would we ever find our way to more? So, like, one of the lenses that I read your book through, and tell me if I'm in the right kind of ballpark or trajectory on this. Like, as I'm working with some churches or individuals whose faith is growing, changing, or trying to figure out how do we create space for people's faith to grow and change and expand, one of the things I've often shared with communities is there needs to be some point of stability that allows for flexibility in other areas. And it felt to me like one of the things that you're doing in this book was saying, like, there's this dissatisfaction that wants some sort of flexibility to grow and expand and change in the way we understand our faith, the way we understand our lives. And the point of stability, then you sort of take the Lord's Prayer and use it as a sort of like catalyst for some categories of what it looks like as something that keeps us sort of rooted and stable in order to allow for that flexibility to happen. Is that a fair way of thinking about it?
Absolutely. Yeah. The Lord's Prayer to me is, if we talk about restlessness, is one of the most common human experiences, something we all share. I feel like the Lord's Prayer or the Jesus Prayer or the Our Father, if you were to take each line and say, what's the question behind that? What is Jesus teaching as an answer? How is this an answer to that? They're the most human questions we could ask. Things like purpose, belonging, provision. Is there enough? Can the world be mended? Will I be safe? Can I be rescued? Those are like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of questions. Those are the really deeply rooted questions. And it does anchor us, and it gives us a way to talk about it rather than just this big spread out territory of like restlessness. It's this big picture. Okay, so let's take that. That's what I've always loved about writing and about anything that I've been able to do, is I really want to take something that's a common concept, but kind of not easy to define, and bring it down to where we can talk practically about it. And, Joan talking about dissatisfaction is one of those big terms, right? It's a beautiful thing. It's something that gets us moving. We don't want to, none of us. I mean, I'm not saying any of us should chase it down. Dissatisfaction is going to come. It's just part of who we are. So having the space for that and the permission for that to say, faith, life, you're going to feel seasons of this like unsettled, dissatisfied place. Let it be your teacher. Let it guide you, because without that, you may never find your way to that next thing that you've always wanted, but you thought it was going to come in the same container. That's what I love about people like Richard Rohr talking about the stages of faith. And he says every stage transition has something to do with pain. We normally don't move until we get moved, or until something of ours is moved. So I love that. And I think that's where the Lord's Prayer helps us, because it pokes those areas of satisfaction and dissatisfaction and says, do you think you have enough? And what is that? How would you even define enough as an American, as a parent, as a spouse? How would you define that? So that's one of the things that I loved about that being kind of an anchoring point of the book. So let's talk about some really human questions here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I appreciated even the way that you approached them, especially some of the lines felt the way that you engaged it, like maybe a less obvious way to engage it, in a way that like moved it into some new and more helpful directions. Or so I think of like the first line that you take there, Our Father. And I have often, when people will preach through, say, the Lord's Prayer, that that line gets preached around God is parenting you, God is safe and trustworthy, God is fathering you, things like that. And then you took it in this direction that maybe had some to do with that, but it was also like a piece of it was about like, what are the metaphors that we're using for God, that we're holding on to? What do we need to do with those metaphors? Yeah, you move into attachment theory around it. Like, there's so many interesting moves that you did with that. I mean, I don't want us to spend our time like covering your whole book, because I do think folks should read it. But I wonder if we could camp out in a few places, and I wonder if you'd mind like camping out here for a minute around like what we do with this idea that like the way that we refer to God is some sort of container to make sense of something that we can't fully grasp and make sense of. But we have all been given those sorts of images that we do something with. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah. This is, I mean, part of the reason I write on this is because I feel like it's there and it's important, but also part of it is just my own heartbreak at watching people who, if this concept of God is what we think it is, which is all knowing, all powerful, all creating, and, by nature beyond us. And then we take a word or a concept and we say, this is God. And we don't ever put a little asterisk at the end and say, actually, this is how we see God. There's a potential for, when I see people who get locked into a metaphor, they stop saying, this is what God is like. And then they say, this is all God can be.
That's good.
And so I see, I used to work with students, and I would see teenage girls who had their fathers were not disobedient, they were abusive and dismissive. And then they would come to church and say, our Father. And they'd be like, nope, sorry. Like you lost me there. And we can sing Chris Tomlin and say, God's a good Father. I understand that. But the box has been built. And so there's only so many places you can go if God is Father, or even if God, if our concept of God is that God is a He. That's building a container for something that transcends any sort of gender, but it does put some stipulations and some boundaries on there. And so there's a point in our life where that metaphor is really good. God as warrior, God as Father, even. I mean, that can be a very nurturing and powerful thing. But there also has to become a point in time where we say yes, and that's not all. So I look at how many names of God there are in the Hebrew tradition. Like it seems like the Hebrew tradition got all this before all of us went and mucked it up. Like there are so many different ways, so many different metaphors, so many different images. And so early on, you can attach to one of those. But more than likely, like I mentioned earlier, some kind of pain is going to show up and is going to dislodge you from that image, from that metaphor. And then you're going to either say, well, I can't have faith because this is the content of my faith. If God is not Father, then how can I be faithful to God? Or even to the point of saying, well, if God is not a He, but the Bible says God is a He, it doesn't say that. But my Bible says God is a He, so how can I trust the Bible? And so people tend to find their way to that Robert Frost, there were two roads in a woods that divided. And a lot of times they think the road less traveled is the one that is the same thing they've always believed. And in truth, sometimes it's the other one where you're able to say, yeah, I can't call God Father. I call God Parent. Maybe God as Mother is a better way of looking at it. Or God as, for me, I've begun using the term the divine. I just feel like that's a bigger container, and I might leave that behind at some point. I interchange them still because the God word still has a resonance for me, but those images are born for us to build an attachment to faith, to community, to the divine. But we're all going to detach from them at one point or another until the moment comes for us to make new attachments. to the concept of the divine, to God as the cosmic one or the unity. And so there's some of that sounds like, oh my gosh, you're surrendering the faith. I'm surrendering a kind of faith, I think, a type of it, but not the whole big F version of it. So that causes two different kinds of restlessness. One among the people who are trying to pursue that, and another amongst the people who are like, we can't, the cat's out of the bag. People know that God is not a guy. So we can't go back to that. But where do we go from here, and how do we preserve this form of faith? So I don't actually know if that answered anything that you asked me.
No, this is great. I didn't even really ask you a question.
Oh, okay, good.
Which I appreciate.
So I can't fail to answer what you didn't ask.
No.
Yes.
I appreciate, my favorite folks that are on here is that I can just say something and you're so like good at what you do that you can talk about a thing for a while, and I can look like a good host because you've got good things to say. But all I really did was like ramble on for a minute, and then you were like, well, I'm going to talk about like this, and I'll do that.
My favorite metaphor for it too, Mike, is just to say that the telescope is not the stars. All of these things are to help us see something that's beyond our own vision. And I'd love to fall in love with that again.
Huh.
Just that thing beyond us.
I love that. I love the way you're talking about this. I underlined that part of your book, that the telescope is not the stars. Like, that was a really resonant metaphor for me. What I think is interesting, and I'm maybe difficult, and I'm kind of curious, is those of us who have had to live out our faith in a public sphere as professional Christians, who had this, like you talk in your book about, like, you get this calling that's supposed to be this higher calling, that's what, and you end up, you're on stage and you're talking about faith, and it can't help but to be through the lens of your own experience, so it can't help but to be informed by your own sort of faith, or then you're writing on it, or in some sort of way you've got a public platform that is expressing your own sort of personal faith. And then what you have expressed at one time doesn't fit who you are and who you're becoming anymore. But it's hard sometimes for people to follow along with you on that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's difficult for people to make sense of that, or to know what to do. So sometimes people will discount you, or sometimes people will say, like, what happened to you? Like, you used to be here, and like, what happened to you? You're following whatever sort of like thing is the thing of the day to say that you're following. And I'm really kind of curious for you, because you talk about this stuff, it feels like somewhat naturally in the way that we're having this conversation here. I'm curious, like, how you've been able to do that sort of a journey in a sphere where you have some level of your faith being really public for folks.
Well, the times it's been confronted, I don't think it hasn't been easy. Easy in the sense of, I guess there's two ways for it to be easy. There's easy in the sense of it makes me feel like we're okay. And there's easy in the sense of, does it make sense to you? Rarely does it make sense to the other person, just as much as it wouldn't have made sense to me had I been in their shoes talking to someone who was in mine. So I really feel like respecting that idea that we are evolving spiritual beings, and that we're constantly changing, and that change means that things are going to shift, and that some people that we were in community with are not going to be able to follow because they're just not ready for that yet, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think part of the problem is when you insert this into a culture that doesn't know how to be civil or how to bear one another's burdens, that becomes really, really difficult, because it's no longer you're evolving or you're changing. It's that you're wrong. And what happens if you take this from me? Like, and there is that little part of people who will go, I think that too, but I couldn't go where you've gone because I don't want to do that. But especially when you're in public, because even public Christian is kind of a container. If you think about it, it's one that we attach to in a way. It's either we attach to it because it pays the bills, or we attach to it because it, and I'm saying all of this in a generous sense, it fills some part of us that we've been given an ability to speak, or to lead or to write or create, and it's being recognized. So there's part of that fills a container. And then at some point, detaching from that idea of God means that also we have to detach from this thing that is a container that used to fill us up. So it's actually for those roles, it becomes even more difficult, because not, somebody who works is a president of a bank who goes through a faith crisis, it doesn't change their job. This is a dual, two things happening at once. And so I think that really makes it difficult, because there's also the common sense impact. Like, why would you change the way you believe about that? And now you've lost your job and you've been working all your life to be in this position. And anybody who's worked all their life to be in that position also has come face to face with the fact that it might not be what you thought it was going to be. So there's some restlessness around that too, that the person who's in that public spot is saying, I can't go back. I can't go back to speaking publicly like that's the position that I take, or that's the metaphor for God that I want to use. But I don't know how to go forward, because anybody I talk to who's had a faith crisis, who's moved on some sort of theological thing, whether it's hell or gender and sexuality, they made up their mind about what they believed a long time ago. The reason they hadn't changed is because of the people that they would lose. It wasn't the theology, it was the relationships
100%.
that held that back. And so losing those relationships is sort of the last tether. I will say, as a caveat, as a person who has the spiritual formation stuff attached to my name, for whatever reason, people feel a lot less shocked when I do that kind of stuff, where I'm like, yeah, I feel like I've moved on this. They're like, oh, that makes sense. Because you're the live on the mountain, stroke your beard kind of guy. So there is that, you're already a mystic.
You're already into the woo-woo.
That's right. You're into crystals and meditation and yoga and whatever. And I tell them, no, yoga is so that I can get out of bed in the morning. That has nothing to do with spirituality. It has everything to do with my joints. But I think that also is a little bit, if you're already a person who's living in this sort of flow, that change that happens, that public change that happens, is a little easier. But I won't sit here and say that isn't costly. Every transition, every change is costly, but every change is also beautiful. Every crucifixion is resurrection. It's just the way the story goes.
Well, it's a good, it's a good segue for us to chat about something else that you spend some time on in your book, of belonging, and of finding rootedness in belonging and what that sort of looks like. And I was thinking of, you mentioned at some point the idea of you come to a point where the things that were shaping you before are no longer what can shape you, and that you're kind of well, what's shaping me now? And a part of that is also who's shaping me, and who, if those spaces of belonging I don't belong in anymore, because either they don't have the space for me, they don't have the capacity to hold me there, or maybe there's some reason where I can't be in that space anymore for my own sake. For whatever reason, you've sort of lost that space of belonging. Do you mind talking a little bit about what does it look like when you're even feeling a little bit in between, where do I fit and where do I belong? What roots you in belonging?
This is something I've been thinking about even beyond the book, just with some of the research and statistics that are out there about friendships in middle age and beyond, especially for men. How few men say they have deep, close friendships. And I don't recall the stats for women, but I don't think it's far behind. I think we're in a bit of a friendship, I don't know, a friendship vacuum. I don't even know if that's the best word, but there is a gap in relationships. And I think that has an impact. I talk in the book about two different kinds of belonging. There's the lowercase belonging, which is the situational connections to God, self, and others. So it's the connection I have with God at my early years. It's the connection I have with others because I'm a parent, our kids play soccer together. There's a connection I have with myself as an able-bodied 21-year-old who can eat Taco Bell after midnight and be totally fine.
Oh gosh, those were the
How
days.
about that, right? I think of that often. Wish I had pictures of those times. So there's that lowercase belonging, and then there's this uppercase belonging that is from the creation of the world. There is this spark within each one of us that roots us and connects us to the divine, that connects us to the divine in other people, and that connects us to the goodness and what in Hebrew it's tov meo, the very good or very exceptionalness of ourselves. The capital B doesn't change. So it's flinty, it's gritty. It doesn't get swayed by circumstances. But the other ones, the lowercase does, because life changes, because I'm no longer 21 and I can't eat Taco Bell at all, because our friendships fade, our kids graduate, our roles change, we get fired, we get hired, we get moved on, or our marriage moves from the honeymoon stage to the early conflict stage, to that deeper, softer, more substantial stage where people look at us in restaurants and go, they don't talk to each other. And in our heads, we're like, we don't really have to. We know what each other is thinking, and we can feel it. So I think that aspect of belonging is understanding, how do we express the capital B belonging, this belonging that never changes, in the situations and circumstances that we're in. And that becomes the real challenge in an isolated kind of culture. And that's kind of what we saw during, I hate to come back to it and make this the pandemic podcast, but that's kind of what we saw during the pandemic, was when you took away our ability to be connected to our typical rhythms of work, of play, of, exercise. I mean, people started to see clearly who they were and what they really believed about God. When, people who were super strong parts of their faith communities, and then the pandemic restrictions lifted and they were like, I can watch this at home. I think I'm going to do that. And I'm not criticizing at all. I'm just saying that's a shift, and that's a shift in how you belong. That it doesn't matter. I mean, you belong to God, whether you're, on your couch eating French toast, watching church, or if you're there in person. That's not what I mean. It's that when we interrogate these present tense, small b belongings, we start to learn a lot about ourselves. We learn a lot about what God is doing in us, changing us, shaping us, bringing to the front, like the dark side that we need to reckon with, our shadow side that we need to interrogate and say, is this really in me? And if so, what do I do with that?
That's so good. There's so much I think we could push into there. Like, I appreciate you talk about, I mean, it's very now in that, like, the core of what creates stability is owning our belovedness, which feels like this, like, really simple thing to say that has, like, a vast ocean underneath it of, like, what does that actually look like, right?
Sure.
But again, I don't want to go through the whole thing. One other area I kind of wanted to ask you a bit about, or like let you just sort of riff on a bit, when you're talking about the section where you take off on give us this day. Mm-hmm. And you talk about sort of contentment within that. And one of the things, I was pulling it up in your book here, one of the things that you said that was really helpful for me is you said compulsive behavior, not restlessness, is the antithesis of contentment. Mm. It was really interesting to me to think about, like, the things that I kind of give myself to in those sorts of ways. Like, that's what's pushing against contentment, not the restlessness that I feel. That, like, that's not the opposite. Like, that was a helpful sort of framing for me. I wonder if you'd just pontificate on that for a moment.
I love that word. Yeah, contentment it was hard to write about because I don't feel like I emulate it at all. I feel like I'm getting there. But there are so many aspects of the season of life we're in that changes that. The book is really revolves around the last 2 or 3 years, and there have just been some massive changes, some very personal massive changes that I talk about. And all that they've done is created a feeling of, a lot of them, what they've done is created a feeling of insecurity, a feeling that everything could go away tomorrow. And that's always been true of human life. I believe what Dallas Willard said, Jesus was the smartest human being that ever lived. And so, the conversations around life is a vapor. Like, life comes and it goes. And I think that lesson is something that I've learned as I've crossed 40 and now I'm staring 50 straight in the face. So I'd love to emulate that idea of contentment. But what compulsive behavior is, and I've dealt with that my entire life. So, from struggling with pornography for so many years to, I grew up in Southern West Virginia, and like most Southern cultures, food has this huge part. And I didn't realize, and this is no one's fault, I'm not blaming any of my relatives for this, but food was more of an event than it was a function of our humanity. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I had over it.
What do you mean by that?
Well, food was not so much something you did. It was, sharing a meal is a great concept. But when you find yourself eating as a way to process emotion.
Oh, okay.
So it wasn't necessarily a device. It was more of an event. Like, this is an event where I'm going to deal with some things. And that's, again, like, I'm not condemning that. I'm just saying there's a point at which that is me, more so me expressing my desires. There are things that I want that I cannot have. And so I'm going to search out the easiest thing to fill that spot. And so as long as I don't think about that, as long as I don't allow the divine to confront me with that. So when I say, give me today the things that I need, I also have to say, I'm taking stuff today because I'm trying to find the things that I need. I'm accumulating, I'm grabbing, I'm stabbing. So here's a story that's not in the book. I saw my chiropractor recently, and I said to her, my thumbs are killing me. And I said, and I know why, and I don't want to tell you because it's embarrassing, but I picked up this mobile video game during the pandemic, and I can't stop playing it. It's a Marvel superhero game, and there's just something about the ability to, like, use my favorite character and punch someone in the face. Mike, I'm 45. I'm 45 years old, and this is what I'm telling. And so I'm like, do I have carpal tunnel? Because I just don't know if I can live with myself having to have surgery because I got involved in it.
Yeah.
So, like, there's the compulsions bringing out the desires, and contentment is the thing that animates the ability to abide in between. So when I look at Jesus in the story of the wilderness, and I think restlessness is a wilderness place, the thing that allowed him to sit in between what Mark calls the wild beasts and the angels, in between the forgotten past and the blessing of tomorrow, the things that allowed him to stay there was this sense that I don't have to grab, I don't have to scrape, I don't have to use any sort of compulsive behaviors to cope with this. I can be here. I can be okay here. And know that eventually this wilderness will end. And I haven't emulated that well for the last 2 years, but I really want to. I really do. Because I don't know.
It's really good.
I think that's the path forward.
It's really good. There's so many more things we could talk about. We've been at this for a little while, so I would love to ask you as we kind of close out. I'm really grateful for your time. I'm really grateful for what you've written. And I was kind of thinking as we close out, you're still engaged with the church. You're creating space for faith to grow and change and expanding and maybe look different than it did in past seasons, but you still have some engagement with the church. And so I'm kind of curious, and this obviously moves us beyond the book, but I'm curious what's giving you hope in the church right now, or what's giving you hope for the church right now in this season? Where are you finding hope? Yeah.
I think probably first and foremost is that I'm sensing a generation that is coming to terms with what the future has to look like. There isn't a plan yet, but there is at least an acknowledgement that contexts have shifted, that we do have to take politics seriously, that it is something that affects the church. I think previous generations were more than willing, and sometimes for very good reason, to say what happens in Washington doesn't affect what happens here. But the more we take into consideration the plight of Black and brown individuals, the things that happen to poor and marginalized countries, the things that are happening to our environment, there is a sense in which being faithful stewards of our lives, being faithful to loving each other as we love ourselves, there's a whole generation that's figuring out the church is going to have to look different to do that to the level and in the way that it needs to. And I'm hearing those conversations and I'm seeing them. I'm also seeing an openness to wisdom, which is really important. I'm seeing an openness, not just to knowledge. Like, I don't just want to read another book. This coming from a person who's talking about a book they just wrote. But there's not just this desire to read another book, but there's a very, I think, faithful and authentic sense of, I want to learn not just what to do, but how to do it and when to do it. And not just how to not be wrong or do evil things. I always loved Dallas Willard again once said there's a big difference between something that's sinful and something that's stupid. And that's the difference of wisdom. Like, you can do something unwise that isn't a sin necessarily. And I think there's a generation figuring that out. And I think you and I talked about this before we came on. I do think, and I've said this on social medias before, and I believe it, it's not just a tagline, the awareness of spiritual formation. Spiritual formation will save the world. This conversation, the practices, the vision is what's going to transform the world. And there are people grabbing a hold of that, realizing that caring for their soul is the best thing they could do for the world, rather than, it's not better to burn out than fade away. I'm sorry, Neil Young, it's just not true. And so they're figuring that out and living that way, embodying new rhythms, finding new teachers. Rich Villodas and John Mark Comer come to mind, people who are really speaking well of how do we live into these new rhythms in a way that changes the world. So that's what's giving me hope. It's a long way to go. And I'm going to stay in this thing as long as I can, keep doing what I can. But there are some generational things that have given me a lot of hope.
So good. Well, Casey, what a gift. What a gift to get to be with you for a bit today. And your book is such a gift. Again, friends, it's The Gift of Restlessness. And pick it up in all the places. And where do folks who want to find you on the internets, where do they find you on the internets?
Yeah, so my website is caseytygrett.com. That's probably easier to be seen than spelled out loud, so I'm going to let that flow, and you can provide that to them. But if you're interested in doing any, have an opportunity there for a soul health assessment, or if you want to do that, we can figure out where you are and where you need to go next. But I'm also on Instagram at Casey Tygrett, and also Facebook. I don't spend a whole lot of time on Twitter anymore. But those two places, you can definitely find me there.
Awesome. We'll throw up all the links in there. Hey, I'm so grateful for you. Thanks for making time today. This was such a gift.
I'm grateful for you too, friend. Thanks for this. Appreciate it.